She brought it up while the pasta was still steaming, while the garlic smell clung to the air and the window was cracked open just enough to let the city's night noise leak into the kitchen. And I remember thinking for half a second that this was going to be one of those conversations about travel plans or refinancing or maybe sex schedules that had quietly turned into calendars and reminders instead of hunger. She twirled her fork, didn't look at me right away, and said in that calm voice she used when she'd already rehearsed something in her head, "I've been thinking a lot about honesty lately, about how people pretend monogamy is natural when it's really just tradition." And even before she finished the sentence, something in my chest tightened like my body had recognized the danger before my brain caught up. I asked her what she meant, because that's what you do when you sense the ground shifting and hope that asking the right question might stop it, and she smiled in that soft, almost proud way, leaned back in her chair, and told me she thought an open marriage could be healthy for us, that it could be a way to grow instead of slowly resenting each other in silence, that modern love didn't have to look like our parents' mistakes. She talked about freedom and trust, and how sex didn't always have to mean ownership, and while her words were smooth, her eyes were steady in a way that told me she wasn't brainstorming, she was presenting. I laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because my nervous system needed an outlet, and I told her she was catching me off guard, that this felt like a conversation people ease into, not something you drop between bites of dinner, and she reached across the table, resting her fingers over mine with a familiarity that suddenly felt rehearsed, and said she didn't want secrets anymore, that she wanted radical honesty, that this was her being brave. I remember noticing how attractive she looked in that moment, the way her collarbone caught the light, the confidence in her posture, and hating myself for feeling desire tangled up with fear, because even then, my body still wanted her, still responded to her certainty. She explained that it wouldn't change what we had, that I was her partner, her home, that sex with others would just be experience, like travel or art, something you do to understand yourself better. And she said it so convincingly that I almost believed the version of reality she was offering, the one where this was mutual exploration instead of unilateral disruption. I asked her if there was someone specific in mind, trying to sound casual while my pulse thudded in my ears, and she tilted her head, gave me a look that was almost indulgent, and said it wasn't about anyone in particular. It was about the idea, about not closing doors just because society told us to. The longer she talked, the clearer it became that she had already walked this path alone, that she had weighed the pros and cons, anticipated objections, prepared answers, and that I was arriving late to a meeting where the agenda had already been set. She spoke about jealousy like it was a solvable equation, about communication as if it could anesthetize pain, and when I tried to explain that this felt less like growth and more like losing the language we'd built our marriage on, she nodded sympathetically while still steering the conversation forward, like a manager acknowledging concerns while rolling out a new policy anyway. I told her I needed time, that I couldn't just flip a switch and redefine commitment on command, and she squeezed my hand again, leaned closer and said, "I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I just need you to be open to the idea." And the way she emphasized the word open made my stomach sink, because it sounded less like an invitation and more like a requirement disguised as progress. She kissed me later that night with the same familiar hunger, her body warm and confident against mine, and there was a moment where the physical closeness almost erased the conversation, where sex felt like it could still glue us together. But even as I pulled her closer, I realized the question had already been answered without me. Lying awake afterward, staring at the ceiling while she slept easily beside me, I replayed every sentence, every practiced pause, every reassuring smile, and it hit me with a clarity that was impossible to ignore, that this hadn't been a discussion about what we might become together, but a notification about who she had already decided to be. I understood then, with a quiet dread that settled deep and stayed there, that the marriage I thought we were protecting had already been reframed in her mind, and that whether I agreed or not, the door she'd opened was not waiting for my permission. By the time we sat down to talk about rules, the conversation already felt like a contract negotiation, where one side had drafted the paperwork and the other was just hoping to avoid hidden clauses. She suggested we take a walk, as if movement might soften the edges, And I remember the night air feeling too cool against my skin, the streetlights blurring slightly as I tried to organize thoughts that refused to line up. She spoke first again, always first, laying things out with the same calm authority she used when making big decisions at work, telling me boundaries were what made this safe. That structure was the difference between chaos and freedom. She said there would be no emotional attachment, that sex was allowed but feelings were off limits, and the way she phrased it made emotions sound like a switch you could flick off with enough discipline. She insisted on full transparency, names disclosed, schedules shared, no secrets, and she emphasized that point with a firmness that suggested she'd already imagined scenarios where trust might fracture. No mutual friends, no coworkers, no overlap with our real life because this wasn't supposed to contaminate what we had, just supplement it. And she said that word like it was harmless, like adding vitamins to a diet instead of replacing meals. I nodded more than I spoke, not because I agreed, but because interrupting felt pointless, and somewhere between her third and fourth boundary, I realized she wasn't checking in to see how I felt. She was checking off items on a list. She looked relieved as she talked, lighter, almost energized, and that contrast made me feel heavy in a way I couldn't quite articulate, like I was watching my marriage get redesigned in real time while being thanked for my flexibility. When I asked what would happen if feelings did develop, if jealousy crept in despite our best intentions, she smiled patiently and said that was where communication came in, that adults handled discomfort instead of running from it. The word adults stung more than it should have, because it framed my hesitation as immaturity instead of instinct, and I felt myself shrink slightly, adjusting to the idea that my role now was to manage reactions rather than express them. She asked me what rules I needed, and I struggled to come up with anything that didn't sound like a plea disguised as a boundary, eventually mumbling something about time management and reassurance, and she agreed quickly, almost too quickly, as if those conditions were easy to meet or easy to ignore. Her confidence was unsettling, the way she seemed certain this would work if we just followed the plan, as if love were a system that could be optimized. As we walked, our arms brushed occasionally, familiar contact sparking a confusing mix of desire and displacement, and I was acutely aware of how much I still wanted her, how attraction doesn't politely step aside when ideology enters the room. There was a moment when she stopped, turned toward me, and kissed me slowly, deliberately, the kind of kiss meant to reassure, and I felt my body respond before my mind could object, the warmth and pressure reminding me why I'd chosen her in the first place. That physical pull made everything harder, because it suggested continuity where there was actually rupture, and I hated how easily sex could still blur the lines she was so carefully redrawing. When she asked if I could live with these rules, if I could see this as an evolution instead of a loss, I heard myself say yes, even as something inside me recoiled, and the sound of my own agreement felt foreign, like I'd signed my name in someone else's handwriting. She squeezed my hand, genuinely grateful, and told me she was proud of us, of me, for being open-minded, and that praise landed awkwardly because it confirmed what I'd been trying not to admit, that the marriage had shifted from a shared instinct to a negotiated arrangement. Later that night, lying beside her again, the rules echoed in my head with an almost bureaucratic precision, and I understood with a quiet, creeping clarity that partnership had been replaced by policy, that love was now something to be managed instead of felt. I stared into the dark, listening to her steady breathing, and realized I wasn't angry yet, just profoundly displaced, like I was still in the room but no longer standing on solid ground. It wasn't loneliness that pushed me to reach out, at least not in the simple sense, but a restless need to remember who I had been before every feeling required a rule and a disclaimer. I was scrolling absently one night, half watching the glow of my phone reflect off the ceiling, when I saw her name appear in a comment thread, familiar enough to make my breath catch before I even realized why. The name pulled something loose inside me, a memory of summer heat and stolen glances and the ache of wanting something you never quite touch. And before I could overthink it, I clicked her profile like muscle memory had taken over. We hadn't spoken in years, not properly, just the occasional like or distant acknowledgement that never crossed into conversation. And yet when I sent the message, it didn't feel like reaching out to a stranger so much as opening a door that had never fully closed. I kept it simple, asked how she'd been, mentioned the coincidence of seeing her name, and when she replied, the ease of it surprised me, the rhythm of her words slotting into mine as if no time had passed. We laughed about the awkwardness of reconnecting, about how life kept looping back on itself when you least expected it to, and there was a warmth in that exchange that felt almost illicit despite how innocent it was. Talking to her felt different from the calculated openness my marriage had turned into, because there was no agenda, no negotiation, no need to define what this was supposed to be. She remembered details I'd forgotten I'd ever shared, the stupid nickname I hated, the way I used to disappear into music when I didn't know how to say what I felt, and that recognition stirred something tender and dangerous in equal measure. There was a lightness to our messages that made me smile at my phone like an idiot, a reflex I hadn't felt in a long time, and I noticed how my body reacted too, the subtle awareness, the hum of attraction that hadn't been dulled by explanation. We started reminiscing, trading half-embarrassing stories about who we'd been back then, and the conversation drifted naturally, unforced, until it felt like we were sitting across from each other instead of separated by years and screens. She teased me gently, the way she always had, and I caught myself imagining the sound of her laugh, the way her eyes used to linger just a second longer than necessary. There was nothing explicit in what we said, nothing that would violate any rule my wife and I had agreed on, yet the intimacy was undeniable, the kind that seeps in quietly and makes itself at home before you notice. What struck me most was how seen I felt without having to perform openness, how she asked questions without prying, how she listened without waiting to redirect the conversation back to herself. I didn't mention the open marriage, didn't frame myself as available or curious or anything at all, and she didn't push, didn't hint, didn't turn the conversation into a test. That absence of pressure made the connection feel honest in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing, and I found myself lingering over her messages, rereading them, letting the familiarity wash over me like a reminder of something essential. There was a moment, late into the exchange, when she joked about how we always seemed to find each other at strange turning points, and the truth of that landed with unexpected weight. I felt a flicker of guilt then, sharp and brief, followed immediately by clarity, because this wasn't about sex or novelty or freedom as it had been described to me. It was about being known without conditions. As I set my phone down and stared into the quiet room, I understood that something had shifted, subtle but irreversible, and that whatever I thought I had lost, I had just found the outline of it again, in a place I hadn't been looking. What changed wasn't a moment so much as a drift, the way conversation slips from daylight into dusk without anyone flipping a switch, and I didn't notice how far we'd gone until I realized I was measuring my days by whether I'd hear from her. Our messages grew longer, slower, stretching late into the night, and somewhere between jokes and memories, we began filling in the spaces of each other's lives, the quiet parts you don't usually offer unless you trust the listener to hold them carefully. I told myself it was harmless, that this was still within the rules, that there was no sex, no touch, no physical betrayal to account for. But my body didn't care about semantics, responding to her words with a warmth that felt unmistakably intimate. She asked about my marriage in a way that was gentle but direct, and instead of giving the polished explanation I'd practiced, I found myself telling the truth as it felt instead of how it was supposed to sound. I admitted that the openness felt imposed, that I was trying to adapt to a version of love I hadn't chosen, and she listened without interrupting, without reframing my discomfort as a growth opportunity. That simple act of being heard created a closeness that was more charged than any explicit flirtation, and when she shared her own disappointments, the moments she'd settled when she shouldn't have, the connection tightened further, pulling us into a shared emotional gravity. There were pauses in our exchanges that hummed with possibility, spaces where a different kind of sentence could have easily appeared, and I was acutely aware of my own restraint, the way desire sat just beneath the surface, controlled but undeniable. I imagined her expressions as she typed, the familiar curve of her mouth when she was thinking, and those images carried a weight that felt dangerously real. The attraction wasn't loud or aggressive, it was quiet and constant, a low heat that made even neutral words feel charged, and I started to understand how intimacy could deepen without a single rule being explicitly broken. The guilt crept in gradually, not as panic but as recognition, because I knew this wasn't what my wife had meant when she talked about freedom. This wasn't casual or detached or easily compartmentalized. It was layered with history and understanding, built on who we were instead of what we wanted to try. One night, after a particularly long exchange where laughter gave way to vulnerability, I caught myself smiling in the dark, phone warm in my hand, and the realization hit with a clarity that left me still, that I was already emotionally somewhere else. She didn't push, didn't escalate, and that restraint only made the connection feel more deliberate, more chosen. And when I finally acknowledged out loud that this felt like crossing a line, she didn't deny it. She said she felt it too, that pretending otherwise would cheapen what was happening, and the honesty in that admission sent a shiver through me that was equal parts fear and relief. We talked about boundaries then, not as rules imposed from outside, but as questions we owed ourselves, and I realized how different this felt from the conversations at home, how much more human it was. When I put the phone down afterward, the room felt altered, heavier, as if something unseen had taken shape and refused to leave. I knew the rule about no feelings had already been broken, not in a dramatic gesture, but in a series of small, intentional choices, and for the first time since the open marriage had been proposed, I felt clear. Whatever I was doing now wasn't about permission or rebellion. It was about responding honestly to something real, and that realization terrified me as much as it steadied me, because it meant there was no longer a way back to pretending this was just an experiment. It started with small changes that were easy to dismiss if I hadn't already been paying attention. The way she took longer to answer messages when she was out, the way her questions shifted from curious to pointed without ever crossing into accusation. She would ask who I'd been talking to, how late I'd stayed up, whether I seemed happier lately, and she framed every question as interest, as care. But there was a tension beneath it that tightened the room whenever she spoke. I could feel her watching me in quiet moments, gauging reactions, comparing versions of me the way someone measures losses they hadn't planned for. She began checking details we'd already agreed didn't need justification, asking follow-ups that felt less like transparency and more like surveillance, and when I reminded her of the rules she'd helped set, she'd laugh lightly and say she was just making conversation. The ease she'd once had with the idea of openness seemed to evaporate as soon as it wasn't exclusively hers, and the confidence that had carried her through those early discussions hardened into something brittle. I noticed how quickly her mood shifted when I mentioned feeling good, how silence stretched when I didn't volunteer information fast enough to soothe her. At the same time, she was distant in ways that were harder to name, physically present but emotionally elsewhere, her touch less instinctive, sex feeling more like proof of relevance than connection. There were nights when she initiated with an urgency that felt competitive, as if closeness were a resource she needed to reclaim, and I went along with it out of habit and residual desire, even as part of me observed the dynamic with growing detachment. The intimacy we shared felt strangely hollow, like a performance meant to reassure rather than a meeting of want, and afterward she'd study my face, searching for confirmation that she still had the upper hand. She started rewriting the rules without calling it that, suggesting that maybe we didn't need full transparency after all, that some details were unnecessary if they caused discomfort, and the irony of it nearly made me laugh. When I pointed out that this contradicted her original insistence on openness, she bristled, accused me of being rigid, of clinging to technicalities instead of prioritizing her feelings. The freedom she'd described so eloquently now came with caveats, exceptions that applied only when she felt threatened, and I began to see how conditional the philosophy had been from the start. What unsettled me most was how quickly she positioned herself as the injured party, as if my calm acceptance of the structure she'd designed were a betrayal in itself. She asked whether I was getting attached to someone, her voice sharp beneath the casual phrasing, and when I answered honestly that I was forming a connection, she went quiet in a way that felt punitive. She reminded me of the no feelings rule as if it were a moral line I'd crossed alone, ignoring how impossible that boundary had always been, and the double standard crystallized in that moment with uncomfortable clarity. I watched her struggle with jealousy she'd assured me was manageable, saw how the idea of my autonomy unsettled her far more than the reality of her own, and the imbalance shifted something fundamental inside me. This wasn't mutual exploration, it was tolerated asymmetry, and I realized how much energy I'd spent trying to accommodate a system that had never been designed for my comfort. Her irritation grew sharper as my apologies faded, and I felt a quiet resolve taking shape where guilt used to sit, a sense that I no longer needed to contort myself to preserve a narrative that was already unraveling. When we argued, it circled the same points endlessly, her accusing me of changing, of becoming distant, of not reassuring her enough, and me pointing out that I was simply living within the framework she'd insisted on. The conversations ended unresolved, heavy with resentment she couldn't quite name without indicting herself, and in those silences, I felt an unexpected calm. The more she tried to pull control back toward herself, the clearer it became that the freedom she wanted had always been meant to flow in one direction, and that realization marked the beginning of my emotional withdrawal, subtle but irreversible. I didn't find out all at once, not through a dramatic confession or a screenshot dropped like a grenade, but through a series of small, badly hidden fractures that finally lined up into something undeniable. It began with a name I didn't recognize slipping out of her mouth one evening, followed by a pause that lingered too long to be accidental, and the way she corrected herself felt rehearsed, as if she'd practiced erasing him mid-sentence. I told myself I was imagining it. That suspicion was a side effect of all this restructuring. But once the idea lodged itself in my mind, everything else started clicking into place with a sickening precision. There were timestamps that didn't make sense. Nights she claimed to be out with friends who later mentioned she'd left early, conversations she abruptly locked down when I entered the room, and a sudden protectiveness over her phone that hadn't existed before openness was supposedly on the table. The irony of secrecy growing in the name of honesty would have been funny if it hadn't cut so deep, and I started replaying those early conversations with a new lens, hearing not just what she'd said, but what she'd avoided. The calm certainty, the lack of curiosity about my feelings, the way she'd already mapped out boundaries, all of it began to feel less like foresight and more like damage control. The truth surfaced one quiet afternoon when I wasn't even looking for it, a message notification lighting up her screen while she showered, the preview just visible enough to register intimacy without context. I didn't touch the phone, didn't need to, because the realization landed fully formed and complete, heavy as a verdict. She hadn't proposed an open marriage to explore honesty. She'd proposed it to legalize a situation already in motion, to retrofit morality around choices she'd made alone. The ground didn't drop out from under me so much as it solidified, all uncertainty snapping into clarity with a calm that surprised me. When I confronted her, I didn't raise my voice, didn't accuse, just stated what I knew and waited, and the silence that followed was louder than any denial could have been. She tried to frame it as timing, as overlap, as something that had started emotionally before it became physical, but the distinctions sounded thin even to her ears. She said she hadn't wanted to hurt me, that the open marriage was supposed to be a bridge, a way to bring me along instead of leaving me behind. And in that explanation I heard the final confirmation, that my consent had never been the point. Every conversation we'd had replayed itself in my head with brutal accuracy, every appeal to modernity and growth revealing itself as a carefully constructed alibi. I thought about how relieved she'd seemed once the rules were set, how confident she'd been that feelings could be managed, and I understood then that she wasn't theorizing, she was reporting from experience. The anger came late and muted, overshadowed by a deeper sense of betrayal that wasn't about sex, but about narrative control, about being cast as a participant in a story that had been written without me. She cried eventually, apologized in a way that centered her fear of consequences more than my pain, and asked if this changed anything, if we could reset now that everything was out in the open. That question, asked so earnestly, stripped away any lingering illusion I'd had about us being aligned, because it assumed forgiveness was just another boundary to negotiate. I told her I needed time, and for once she didn't argue, maybe sensing that something fundamental had shifted beyond her reach. Alone later, I sat with the truth until it stopped vibrating, until it felt less like a wound and more like information, and I realized with startling clarity that the open marriage hadn't created the fracture, it had simply given it a name. The person I'd been trying to accommodate, to reassure, to protect from discomfort, had already stepped outside our shared reality, and understanding that didn't devastate me the way I'd expected. Instead, it freed me from the obligation to keep pretending we were navigating this together, because now I knew exactly when she'd left, and exactly why she'd needed me to follow. Something in me went quiet after that, not numb, but resolved, like the internal noise had finally burned itself out and left behind a clean, steady signal. I stopped apologizing for things I hadn't broken, stopped explaining my tone, my timing, my moods, and the absence of those reflexive reassurances changed the air between us almost immediately. She noticed, of course, asked if I was pulling away, if I was punishing her, and I told her calmly that I was just being honest, using the same word she'd leaned on so heavily when this all began. The truth was simpler than any accusation. I was no longer orienting my life around her comfort. I leaned into what felt real instead of what felt negotiated, letting my connection with the woman from my past deepen without theatrics or secrecy, not because I needed revenge or validation, but because the clarity of it grounded me. We talked openly about what this was and what it wasn't, about how attraction had grown naturally out of familiarity, how desire didn't feel like a resource being taken from someone else, but something shared freely. There was sexual tension between us that hummed constantly, present even in mundane conversation, a pull that didn't demand action to be acknowledged, and that restraint made it feel intentional rather than impulsive. When we finally saw each other in person, the familiarity was immediate and disarming, the kind of comfort that settles in your body before your mind can catch up. Sitting across from her, watching the way she held my gaze without calculation, I felt a sense of alignment I hadn't realized I'd been missing, and the attraction between us was quiet, but unmistakable, charged without needing to be proven. There were moments when our knees brushed, when the space between us felt deliberately maintained, and the restraint carried more weight than any rushed encounter could have. At home, my wife oscillated between irritation and pleading, between accusations that I was changing and demands that I reassure her I wasn't leaving, and I responded with a calm that seemed to unnerve her more than anger ever could. I didn't argue anymore, didn't defend my right to exist within the structure she'd designed, and that refusal to engage on her terms shifted the power dynamic she'd been trying so hard to control. I could see her struggling to recalibrate, to pull me back into a role where my reactions validated her choices, but I no longer needed to participate in that cycle. I began preparing quietly, not with dramatic declarations but with practical steps, organizing finances, imagining spaces that didn't include her presence, letting the idea of a different future take shape without guilt. The more intentional I became, the less reactive I felt, and that steadiness was something she couldn't mirror, couldn't manipulate into reassurance. When she accused me of drifting, of emotionally abandoning the marriage, I told her that detachment wasn't abandonment, it was clarity, and that I was finally choosing what aligned with me instead of what kept the peace. The contrast between the two connections sharpened everything, the way one required constant negotiation and the other thrived on mutual respect, the way one hid truths to maintain control while the other allowed space for understanding. I wasn't naive about the risks, about how new beginnings can carry their own illusions. But the difference lay in intention, in choosing rather than accommodating. For the first time in a long while, I felt like my actions belonged to me, guided by alignment instead of fear, and that sense of ownership was intoxicating in a way that had nothing to do with sex and everything to do with self-trust. As I moved through my days, I noticed how little I thought about managing my wife's reactions anymore, how the weight I'd been carrying slowly lifted as I reclaimed emotional autonomy. The marriage hadn't ended yet, but something definitive had, the version of myself that bent to fit a narrative that erased him. I wasn't running toward something new so much as standing still long enough to recognize what was already there. And in that stillness, I chose intention over obligation, clarity over comfort, and the quiet certainty that whatever came next would be built on truth rather than permission. She chose a Sunday afternoon for it, the kind of quiet window she'd always favored for serious conversations, when the world felt paused and there were fewer distractions to absorb the impact. We sat across from each other in the living room, light spilling in through the windows, and I could tell from the way she held herself that this wasn't a discussion so much as a correction she expected me to accept. She said she couldn't do this anymore, that the openness was hurting her, that she'd underestimated how it would feel now that things had shifted, and as she spoke, she framed her discomfort as evidence of growth, as if emotional reversal were the same as accountability. She told me she wanted to close the marriage again, to return to something safer, more traditional, and the way she said again implied a reset that erased everything in between. She accused me of changing, of becoming distant and unrecognizable, of no longer prioritizing us, and there was a sharpness to her words that suggested she believed she was reclaiming moral high ground. I listened without interrupting, noticing how familiar her language was, how easily she slid back into directing the narrative once the outcome threatened her comfort. When she finished, she waited for my reassurance, for the promise that I'd fall back into place now that she'd decided the experiment was over, and the silence that followed stretched long enough to make her shift in her seat. I told her calmly that I wasn't willing to close the marriage just because the terms no longer favored her, that this wasn't something you could toggle based on who felt empowered at the moment. I reminded her that this structure had been her idea, that I'd resisted, adapted, and ultimately taken it seriously, and the look on her face told me she hadn't expected me to hold that line. She said I was being cruel, that I was choosing someone else over her, and I didn't deny that my priorities had changed, only clarified that they'd changed because the truth had finally surfaced. I pointed out the hypocrisy in asking for closure now that she felt threatened, in demanding sacrifice from me to restore a sense of control she'd already relinquished. My refusal wasn't angry or dramatic, and that composure seemed to unsettle her more than any outburst could have, because it left no opening for manipulation. The conversation escalated as she tried different angles, appealing to our history, to fear, to obligation, and when those failed, to accusation, suggesting I was using her own idea against her. I told her that I wasn't weaponizing anything, that I was simply refusing to erase my own experience to preserve her comfort, and the words landed heavily between us. She demanded to know who I was becoming, said she didn't recognize me anymore, and I realized with a strange calm that this was the most honest thing she'd said all day. She issued the ultimatum plainly then, telling me I had to choose, that the marriage couldn't survive this ambiguity, and for the first time, the stakes were clear without distortion. I didn't hesitate, didn't bargain for time, just told her that I wasn't going to close myself down to make her feel safe again, that the version of us she wanted no longer existed. The finality of that answer settled into the room like dust, quiet but irreversible. After she left the room, slamming the door harder than necessary, I sat alone and felt the weight of what had just happened, not as loss, but as release. The marriage hadn't shattered in that moment. It had simply reached the point where pretense could no longer hold it together. I understood then that the breaking point wasn't about openness or jealousy, or even infidelity. It was about control, about who got to define reality and when. As the house fell silent, I felt a steady certainty take root, knowing that whatever came next would be chosen, not imposed, and that this refusal was the first thing I'd said in a long time that felt entirely like my own. She told me on a night that felt deliberately ordinary, as if choosing calm was her way of honoring the weight of what she was about to say. We were sitting together after dinner, plates pushed aside, the conversation drifting lazily the way it had learned to do, and I remember thinking how rare that ease felt now, how fragile. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking, the kind of pause that signals intention rather than hesitation, and said there was something she needed to tell me before I made any irreversible decisions, something she'd held back not out of fear, but out of respect. When she said my wife's name, my stomach tightened reflexively, and when she explained that they'd crossed paths months earlier through overlapping social circles, the pieces aligned too cleanly to ignore. She told me she'd known about the affair before I ever did, that she'd recognized the signs immediately, the half-hidden intimacy, the careful omissions, the familiar choreography of secrecy. Hearing that knowledge had existed parallel to my ignorance was disorienting, not because it humiliated me, but because it reframed every step I'd taken since the open marriage had been proposed. She explained that she hadn't said anything because she didn't believe it was her place to intervene in a truth I hadn't yet discovered on my own, that forcing awareness would have made her complicit in a collapse she hadn't caused. There was no self-righteousness in her voice, no triumph, just a steady clarity that made it impossible to mistake her intention. She said she'd waited because she respected me enough to let me arrive at the truth when I was ready, to choose my response without being pushed or manipulated. The contrast hit me harder than the revelation itself, because one woman had concealed the truth to protect herself, while the other had withheld it to protect my agency. That distinction settled into me slowly, spreading outward as I replayed months of interactions with new understanding. I thought about how my wife had framed openness as courage while hiding the catalyst that made it necessary, how she'd curated honesty to serve her timeline, her comfort. In comparison, the quiet restraint across from me felt like integrity without performance. I asked why she was telling me now, and she said because the ground had shifted, because I was no longer operating under illusions, and because choices made with partial truth were still compromises. She said she didn't want to be a consolation prize or a reaction, that whatever we became needed to be built on clarity, not coincidence. The seriousness of that boundary deepened the attraction between us in a way that felt earned rather than rushed, and the awareness of how much she valued intention made desire feel steadier, less urgent, more deliberate. There was sexual tension in the air, undeniable but contained, the kind that comes from mutual understanding rather than pursuit, and in that moment I realized how different this felt from the chaos I'd been navigating. Nothing was being extracted from me, no reassurance demanded, no narrative imposed. She wasn't asking me to choose her. She was offering truth and letting me decide what to do with it, and that distinction made all the difference. When I left that night, the city felt sharper, more defined, as if clarity had adjusted my vision. I wasn't angry anymore, not at my wife, not at myself, not even at the situation, because the final piece had settled into place. The open marriage hadn't been a mutual experiment gone wrong. It had been a cover story, and now that cover had been stripped away completely. What remained was the simple, unglamorous truth of character, of how people handle power when they think they control the narrative. I understood then that love wasn't just about desire or history or even honesty in the abstract. It was about timing, intention, and respect for another person's autonomy. One woman had tried to rewrite reality to keep me aligned with her choices. The other had stepped back and waited for me to choose my own path. As I walked home alone, that difference echoed louder than any argument we'd ever had. And for the first time since all of this began, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt defined by something solid, something earned, and something I was finally ready to claim. The end didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors or last-minute confessions meant to rewrite history, and that absence of chaos felt almost surreal given how long tension had filled every corner of our lives. We sat at the kitchen table one final time, the same place where she'd first framed upheaval as progress, and the symmetry wasn't lost on either of us. She tried to speak first out of habit, but I gently stopped her, not out of spite, but because I no longer needed her version of the story to understand my own. I told her I was done negotiating my reality, done participating in structures designed to absorb the consequences of decisions I hadn't made. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with losing control of the narrative she'd curated so carefully. She said she never meant for it to end like this, that the open marriage was supposed to save us, and I believed that she believed that, even if the truth was more complicated. I told her that intentions didn't erase impact, that honesty offered after the fact wasn't the same as respect, and that I no longer wanted a relationship built on loopholes and retroactive permission. The words came out steady, uncharged, and I could see how much that unsettled her, because there was nothing left to argue against. She asked if there was anything she could do, if we could start over now that everything was exposed, and I realized how often starting over had been her solution, a reset button that absolved without accountability. I told her starting over only worked when both people were standing in the same truth, and that we weren't. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, just final. And in that stillness I felt a surprising calm, the kind that settles when a decision aligns fully with who you've become. The logistics were straightforward, almost clinical, dividing time, space, responsibilities without drama, and that practicality felt like mercy rather than coldness. She cried once, quietly, and I didn't rush to comfort her, not because I lacked compassion, but because I understood that some grief has to be carried alone. When I walked out with the last box, there was no sense of escape, no rush of triumph, just a grounded awareness that something incomplete had finally been allowed to end. In the weeks that followed, the absence of constant negotiation felt like oxygen returning to my system, and I noticed how much energy I'd spent bracing myself against expectations that no longer existed. My connection with the woman who had waited unfolded without urgency, built on conversations that didn't require disclaimers, on attraction that didn't need to be justified as freedom or growth. There was sex, yes, but it wasn't the point or the proof. Just one expression of a broader alignment that felt steady and unforced, rooted in mutual choice rather than opportunism. What surprised me most was how little resentment I carried forward, how the open marriage that had once felt like an existential threat now registered as a revelation instead. It hadn't destroyed my life or my capacity for love. It had exposed the fault lines that were already there, the ways control had been disguised as progress and honesty rationed to suit convenience. Losing the marriage didn't feel like failure so much as release, a shedding of a version of myself that had learned to equate endurance with commitment. I didn't walk away with a sense of victory, but with dignity, and that distinction mattered more than I'd expected. I chose a relationship defined by transparency instead of technicalities, by intention instead of permission, and that choice felt like a return to something essential rather than a leap into the unknown. Looking back now, I see the proposal for what it was, not a catalyst for destruction, but a mirror held up to a truth I hadn't been ready to face. Love, I learned, isn't modern or traditional, open or closed, progressive or safe. It's simply honest or it isn't. And when honesty is delayed or curated, it erodes trust long before any rule is broken. Walking forward, I carried that clarity with me, not as armor but as grounding, knowing that whatever shape love takes next, it will be built on shared reality rather than carefully managed illusion.